It is absolutely my privilege to introduce to you our friend, Dr. Lenny DiLorenzo. I'll tell you a little bit about him, but I think it's better sometimes, Lenny, when you tell him about it, but I'll tell you a little bit about him. So you know that he is a graduate of Monterey, and in his time here, he was the ASB president. The kids went out to find his picture on the wall in the back. He was our valedictorian. Were you the captain of the soccer team?
Yeah.
He was the captain. But I got to tell you, playing with me, he was involved in campus ministry. He was a retreat leader. But the gift we have, Stephen Allendio and I have, is that Lenny has stayed in our lives through the years. And to watch this monarch grow into be not the professor, the man he is today. I could read you his credentials that are very, very, very impressive. He's just written his 11th book. Well, 12th.
It's just one book that I keep publishing over and over again.
Somebody else's books I can read. But there are two things, especially you as parents here, that as I introduce him, is that he has the most wonderful wife and the most adorable 6 children. Yes, it really, really is. Oh, you could talk about that a little bit. Tomorrow, Lenny will be speaking to all of the teachers and staff of the Diocese of Orange. That's how we got here tonight. But tonight, it is our honor, our privilege to welcome him home to share his wisdom with each and every one of you. So thank you. We love you, and we want you to love Lenny because we love him. They're all yours.
All right, dear. Thank you. All right. She is the best, isn't she? Well, so good to see all of you. Thank you for welcoming me here. I had a surreal experience earlier today. I was walking over by, is that the 100 wing right there, I think, where I used to have my locker, and there are no lockers anymore. So that wasn't the surreal part, but I was turning the corner, and a couple students, I had spoken to the students this morning, and a couple students were walking, I said something, and one of them said, "Do you know Meredith?" And I said, yeah. She goes, "I'm her daughter." And I was like, what? Because I graduated 25 years ago. And of course, my children are high school age. I have one in college now. But somebody I haven't seen for 25 years, and there was her daughter, as a modern day student, right? The other surreal experience I had was sitting in rush hour traffic, which we don't have in South Bend, Indiana. I'm out of the practice. I'm why aren't you people moving? We're all trying to go the same direction. But I graduated 25 years ago, and in all of those 25 years, I've been in a university setting at this point. So I went to the University of Notre Dame, and I never left. So I stayed there. I started working right after I graduated, did my graduate degrees there, and then continued to work and now teach there as well. Met my wife there. She was from Roanoke, Virginia. Stayed there, and then we started pulling some of her family a little bit closer there as well. But because I've been on a college campus for all this time, I've sort of by default developed a little bit of an expertise in college students, not because of any kind of special insight or ability on my part, but the same way in which, I don't know, somebody who gets locked in a bowling alley for a week becomes an expert on bowling. I've just happened to be there for a long time, right? And teaching students in the classroom, forming and mentoring students for different kinds of programs. And then I do a fair bit of traveling to other colleges, but also to high schools and things like that. And so I've been really paying attention over these years to not just what do students know when they enter into college settings, but what's going on with their formation in the high school years and beforehand, and what kind of needs and what kind of gifts are they bringing with them into college settings. So I thought tonight would be a good opportunity to reflect on a bit of that with you through some stories maybe, but also some observations, some things I've seen, some things I want to propose, and in some ways some reflections on Mater Dei as I know it, and Mater Dei as I think together seeking to continue to build this educational community. All right. So I want to start with something that I saw in the New York Times some years ago. Part of the reason for me telling you that I saw something in the New York Times is to impress upon you that I'm cultured and educated. I was just reading the New York Times, right? So anyways, I was going through the New York Times, and I found there was this series of question and answer articles. There was like 5 of them. And the recipient of the questions was at that point, the Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid at Harvard. This is a really important position, not just at Harvard, but if you think about it, in the American educational landscape writ large. Because what this man and his team decide affects all the other colleges and universities, and therefore affects all the high schools that are seeking to prepare students for college, right? So people were writing into him with various questions. It was from, high school students, from parents, from teachers, from guidance counselors, 5-part series. All of it was really interesting. But I came upon at least this one part that I found especially interesting, and I want to share it with you. It's from this mother. Her name is Colleen Smith, and that is not her. That is Google search image for mother and daughter. That's okay. So here's what she wrote in from Colleen Smith. I once attended a preschool admissions tour where a parent actually asked how many of the preschool's graduate had attended Ivy League colleges. My daughter is now in 3rd grade and participates in only one extracurricular activity because she values free time and wants to play. Nonetheless, when I cross paths with my daughter's overscheduled horse-jumping, violin-playing peers, I can't help but wonder whether my choice to let my girl play will eventually leave her wanting in the eyes of an admissions committee. I found that rather striking, but also rather relatable. I was at that point when I read this, I think my oldest was maybe in middle school, thinking about these things, recognizing other parents that I'm around who are thinking about these things, and then of course going to various high schools throughout the country and speaking and things like that. I know what she's talking about, right? There's a sense of, a sense of anxiety here in this mother. On the one hand, am I doing right by my daughter by allowing her to pursue what she wants to pursue, to value her free time? Am I doing wrong by her because I'm not pushing her into all of these other activities that her peers are doing? Somewhere in the distance in this mother's imagination is the concern that when her daughter becomes some kind of file on a table for admissions committee, she will be found wanting. And so this mother, Colleen Smith, it seems to me, wasn't worried about getting one thing or the other wrong. In some ways, she was worried about getting the whole thing wrong. But she also sees there's a clear downside to that game that everybody else is playing. So here's what William Fitzsimmons said in response. That is actually him. Google image search for William, and he has an image up there. So here he is. He says, "It is common to encounter even the most successful students who have won all the prizes, stepping back and wondering if it was all worth it. Professionals in their 30s and 40s sometimes give the impression that they are dazed survivors of some bewildering lifelong boot camp. Some say they ended up in their professions because of someone else's expectations, or that they simply drifted into it without pausing to think whether they really loved their work. Often they say they missed their youth entirely, never living in the present, always pursuing some ill-defined goal." So in some ways, he's responding to her. He's saying, yes, I know what you're talking about, and I see the perils of it. On the other hand, he doesn't respond to it, right? Because she's worried about, will my child be found wanting in the eyes of an admissions committee later on? But this got me thinking about a number of things. And one of the things it got me thinking about was not necessarily, let's say, if Colleen Smith's child or some other child doesn't win this game that they're playing. It actually got me thinking about, what about those who do win the game? In other words, who do get that goal they were seeking after, the admission to the college of their dreams and things like that. I wanted to take some time and analyze and think about, what does it look like for them? Because that's a way of asking the question about the game itself, right? Not what it costs to lose the game, but actually if you win it, then what happens? Does that make sense? So that's where I wanted to go with some reflections on that. Now, I've been teaching at Notre Dame. So I've been working at Notre Dame for 21 years, but I've been teaching for 10 or 11. And in some of the courses that I teach, theology courses, sometimes that border on literature, art, philosophy, other things, but all within the realm of theology. In some of these courses, some of the assignments at times allow for personal reflection in connection with what we're studying. So theology is not faith sharing, but there are sometimes opportunities if students want to take that up to bring in some personal things into contact with what we're studying. One of these assignments, in a course I've taught a number of times, is to follow along with, and these are the questions we're asking, by the way. What game are we asking young people to play, and what happens when they win? One of the assignments, to go back to what I was saying, is students take Augustine's Confessions, and they basically imitate the style of his confessions, but they confess some things from their own life. Confession, sometimes of sin, but of praise, of longing, of things like this. That's what Augustine's doing in the Confessions. In any event, I receive these from students over the years. I have hundreds of these and other assignments like these, where they're little snapshots or windows into the students' lives. They're really kind of privileged things that I get to receive. And I wanted to share one of them with you from one of the students, Marissa Brown, who is an exceptional student, super smart. By the end of college, I think you would say, this is a really deeply integrated person. But she was recognizing some things about herself in and through this writing. So I want to share with you a little bit of her testimony. By the way, I always ask the students before I share any of their writing. And I tell my students, sometimes I'll share other people's stuff in class. I'm like, don't worry. When you give me something, it doesn't mean it's just public property. I will always ask you. So I did ask her. This is her reflection, which I call crushing the game. In her words, throughout high school, I accumulated A's, like the rich man in Luke's gospel accumulated the grain from his harvest. As the seeds that had been planted at the very start of my education bloomed, I reaped the fruits of the harvest of my intellect. I collected each honor and accolade, each high test score and good grade, building up an impressive resume full of my achievements, storing them all for the future goal of applying to college. College admissions were on my mind from the time I started high school. My college prep school was filled with people like me. We were all headed to college, and many of us were striving for admission to some of the best schools in the country. The environment demanded excellence, encouraging my desire and reinforcing the pressure to perform exceptionally well. Like many of my peers, when it came to the college admissions process, I not only played the game, I crushed it. I joined more clubs than I had an interest in attending as padding for my resume. I decided that I would earn a GPA above 100 on a 100-point scale through getting high grades in weighted honors and AP classes. My intensity continued through my senior year. I edited my college application essay to perfection, crafting it into a masterpiece. I even applied to some very prestigious schools that I had no interest in attending because that was what people with my grades and test scores were expected and encouraged to do. She then goes on to say later, even when she was writing this confession, she was worried about getting an A. She's like, I want to get this right, so I get an A on this, Now, not only do I understand this from a teacher's perspective or somebody on the college side, I understand this from her side, because that is very much what I was like, for sure. In some ways, it's what allowed me and people like me to get into the kinds of schools we got into. But I also recognize there was a lot of work to be done afterwards to slowly unbecome just like that, which I am still a lot like that, actually, to my detriment. Now, I want to, as I said, sort of diagnose the winners. Things that I've seen, because I'm in a college environment where a lot of people played this game and won it, right? People don't get into Notre Dame by accident. It is either their dream school or it's a very respectable backup school. But don't tell them that I said that, right? This is the kind of place that people are aiming for. They don't end up there on accident. So in diagnosing or sort of looking out over these years at our student body, students in our classroom, students on campus, talking with them, kind of thinking about some of these things, talking with my colleagues, what could we say are some of the marks of the students that we're seeing, the high-achieving students in places like this? And I've shared some of this at other colleges or other high schools, and they say, yeah, that's pretty much on point, right? So here are some of the things I've noticed. There are really 4 marks. 1, busyness itself has become a status symbol, and you get a little merit badge for lack of sleep. What do I mean by this? It is an embarrassment if you were to say on some particular day that the night before you didn't have that much to do. It is a sign of your status and importance if you had so much to do all of the time. In fact, it's a kind of bragging about being overwhelmed. And then you get a little extra street cred if you say, I didn't sleep. right? Because I was so busy. This seems to be sort of common parlance, right? Nobody's thinking about, I've got to do this. It's just sort of expected. This is the way to kind of talk to one another, like to brag about the busyness. Complain about it, but brag about it at the same time. Secondly, resume lines are currency. So you heard a little bit about this in Marissa's testimony. In other words, things that you can do, experiences, activities, even forms of service, things you can get involved in. All of these things are currency on a resume for a later cash in, right? You'll spend this later on, in other words. Now, these are the same people, most of the time, who did this kind of thing to get into college. But what happens when they get in college? They shift, because they've been sort of formed that way, they shift that same behavior towards new horizons and new goals. Grad school, the prestigious, well-paying internship that leads to the job that leads to whatever, right? So resume lines are currency. Third, anxiety is the new normal. I don't think this is a surprise to any of you. There is an incredible uptick in diagnosed anxiety disorders, but even for those without diagnosed disorders, the basic, water that everybody's swimming in now is even more than 15 or 20 years ago, a pervasive sense of anxiety. Of what is anxiety? It's fear without a direct object, right? It's just a sense of uneasiness, of worrying that you're not doing something, missing out on something, forgetting something, not doing enough, like that kind of feeling of always being behind. And then fourth, non-commitment is an art form. Or maybe we'll put it this way, a multiplicity of soft commitments. What do I mean by that? So sometimes I've asked students, like in this course I teach on character, hey, when do you guys make plans for Friday night? And they're like, oh, usually around Tuesday, Wednesday, you start to get a feel of like what might be going on. And, some of the options are out there. I'm like, yeah. So like, when do you make the plans? We're like, well, they're kind of around there on Tuesday, Wednesday. So usually, I guess by Thursday, we're like pretty much settling into the plan, and that'll sort of linger there for a moment. And then they're like, well, I guess Friday morning, we're kind of seeing and assessing like what else is going on. And like maybe Friday afternoon, things shift. And eventually they'll get to the point of being really honest. They're like, you know what, the plans aren't firm until we actually have already done the thing, Or part of the non-commitment being an art form is dating is just way down. Way down. In college settings, like in young adult life, dating is way down. Why? Because dating is a kind of commitment, right? What's the first requirement of dating someone? Stop dating other people. Like, stop being interested in other people. But it's closing down of options. Or when it comes to choosing something to do for the summer, or even especially after college, lots of things swimming around, reopening old things that you foreclosed on, to keep as many options open as possible. So to keep, none of the burners on the stove all the way up, keep them all on simmer as long as possible. And it's a kind of art form. I don't know what kind of art, but it's a kind of art form. As many soft commitments as possible. Now, this is the doom and gloom portion of our program. So, you ever seen The Lord of the Rings, right? Especially in the Two Towers, when they go to Helm's Deep and it's like, this is the end. Like, this is just absolute darkness. And they're like, let us ride out and we'll have a glorious end of it, right? Like, they're going into certain death. I love that moment. I try to recreate that moment most of the times when I speak. Like, let's go as dark, as deep as dark as possible. Because then you get that glorious moment when Gandalf shows up in the sunrise. Okay, so I live for that. I just can't get away from that pattern. Like, that's the way I approach things. So here's another part of it. The cost of winning. Here's another testimony from a different kind of assignment, but from a different one of my students. Her name's Yujin. She was a pre-med student heading towards medical school. She's being held there by, no, I'm just kidding. She's the one holding. She said, that's my daughter. Which one is that? Gianna. That was several years ago. She said it was the first time she ever held a baby. I was like, well, don't drop her, but also good job. Yeah. She was at our house. Here's a little testimony, a little piece of something that she was writing about. Maybe I'll move this thing. Is that all right? give you a little bit. I'll help you see that better. Great. She wrote, I have certainly become more career-driven during my years in college, and now, as a junior, I've begun to persuade myself to distance myself from friends, from religion, and from other relationships that take time and effort, because the only thing that will matter at the end of college is my GPA and whatever graduate program I am accepted into. As a result, I have made myself vulnerable to letting ambition control my life, and have even become miserable in fulfilling my, quote, dreams and goals. I've lost the true goals behind acquiring an education, goals that seemed so clear when I first began my Notre Dame journey. I feel that I am no longer the same person who wrote about wanting to get to know God as the answer to the question, why are you applying to Notre Dame? Now, Eugen never made the choice to have this kind of shift, right? She's now having, fortunately, the moment to look back and reflect on this, which is also a kind of crisis moment, which is a good thing that she's recognizing this, right? I think it's more of the slow formative effect of that kind of culture I was just talking about, being in that kind of culture, which isn't just distinctive to Notre Dame, as I think you know. This is a kind of common culture among the high-achieving students. But it is a way of seeing what is the effect of the game they were formed to play, to seek after this prestige, to seek after these goals, right? And then not to be able to break from that way of seeking. Guess what? I was reading the New York Times again just this week. Do you see the date on there? September 7th, 2024. So the New York Times keeps pointing these things out, but they don't have a response to it. So this was actually from a high school teacher. I forget where he teaches. But the opinion piece itself, which I thought was fairly perceptive, he actually began it by tallying up the number of declared valedictorians at some of these various high schools. This is a strange phenomenon to me because I don't think they understand what a valedictorian is. But apparently this one school, even it's in Fullerton, what was it, Sunny Hills? Yeah, had 606 valedictorians. Yeah. So they have like a set of criteria for being a valedictorian. You basically have to get everything right in all these boxes, and then you're declared a valedictorian. And then he brought up a number of other schools at these high numbers. I've seen some of this around where we live too, where it's a multiplicity of valedictorians. But what they're doing, it seems, is in order not to separate one or a few people from the rest, they need to be able to elevate as many people as possible, because that's what the students, the families want. That's what they think, this is what the colleges want. They have to be in the top 1%, right? They can't be down below. And he's pointing this out that as a high school teacher, and I think he's a guidance counselor too, it's now become even more difficult for colleges to get to know the texture of the students because they all appear the same. So they have to start looking at other things. And now the students are concerned about the other things that they do and putting that into some of the package. So he's complaining about this and saying this is completely out of control. And we see the effect it's having on young people, right? It's pulling them apart. They're overtaxed. They're overbusy. They're feeling empty. They're having these kind of results that we saw there also, right? But there doesn't seem to be much of a response, except we have to do something different. And this is something that I've noticed in a lot of the literature and people who speak about this thing. We become very good at saying, here is the problem. It's kind of like those people many people who speak against climate change. Here are the problems, here are the problems, here are the problems. But the substantive solutions that will galvanize people, we're kind of lacking in those. And actually, he brings that up as a comparison. So I think that might be where we have an opportunity to kind of step in here as the kind of educational community that this is at Mater Dei. But what I'm going to say is not just this is what Mater Dei is. I'm also, and most especially, going to say I think this is the challenge of Mater Dei. It's something in some ways in front of us always. And it's in front of us always. I include myself in this as an alum, as somebody who's very committed to this place, for the administration, the faculty, but even in some ways, especially for the families, for the parents, last of all, probably for the students. They can't make the decisions about this, right? But when I say for the families and for the parents, I also mean our kind of expectations of what we look for our students, and therefore what we expect of our schools. Make sense? Because, as you know, like I said, I've traveled a lot. I think the East Coast and Southern California are the most hyper college prep cultures I've been in, honestly. And it's a competitive educational environment. And the schools can't just go in any direction they want because they also have to respond to the desires and the needs of the community, right? Because enrollment matters. And because the vitality of the schools matter. So when I bring these things up, which might sound a little bit aspirational, it's not to say, well, here's what the school should do, or here's the challenge in front of the school, as if it's just the people who receive paychecks from the school. I'm saying this and proposing this and hopefully opening this up for us as a way of thinking about this as a broader school community. Okay? So I think this is a picture of the grotto from like the 1950s. Yeah. Honor, glory, love. Now, you may or may not know this, but president of the school, Sir Brennan, has become even more interested in reclaiming this educational motto for the school. Honor, glory, love. To really dig into what does this mean and what guides this, and how does this show us, again, in a new way, our mission as a modern day community. And it will, in the end, relate back to our Blessed Mother. It's not by accident that she resides right in the heart of campus and that this school is dedicated to her. It is dedicated to the Mother of God. Part of what I'd like to propose to you, and I had some conversations, Mr. Brennan, about this, part of what I'd like to propose to us, there's more to say than I'll be able to say, is the way in which this education that we seek to offer here at Modern Day is a deeply personal education, because it departs from and goes back to this person, Mary. Mary, who was the first and perfect disciple. Mary, who was attentive and obedient. Mary, who was sacrificial and courageous. And I think there is maybe some ways in which we can reflect on the honor, glory, love to bring us back to that. Not that we've gotten away, but to see this is the new challenge in our present day and age. So I'm going to go through this in a little bit of reflection on Mary. That'll be briefer. And then I'm going to share with you some things that I think we can share with the young people. And I mean this both as the educators and then the primary educators, the parents, to guide them in ways of life, forms of life. Okay? You're with me on this? All right. If you start to get bored or this is too, just tell me, we'll go drink wine and we'll be friends again. So let me do a little bit on each of these three. First on honor. When we say honor, what might we understand or how might this relate back to Mary? And I'm going to present each of these three, honor, glory, love, according to certain mysteries of the life of Mary in relation to her son. In the Annunciation, I've actually done a lot of work on the Annunciation, biblical studies and other things, but a couple of things that we should be attentive to in the Annunciation. By the way, this is great religious art. This is Fra Angelicos. Some of the other images I will show you are like a little bit not great religious art, but I didn't want to have a lot of text up here. So I just had to find things that worked, okay? So don't expect this quality of religious art the whole time. In the Annunciation to Mary follows the Annunciation to Zechariah in Luke's Gospel. They seem very similar, but the differences are utterly important. Zechariah at the end is struck mute, as if he's punished. Mary speaks her great fiat, let it be done to me according to your word, and is exalted, is in some ways it seems freed. What gives? Well, without going into the whole lesson, what gives is their response to the announcement is subtly but decisively different. When the angel appears and addresses Zechariah, it says to us, he was troubled and he feared. When the angel appears to Mary, in the Greek, it says she is greatly troubled, even more troubled. And so the attentive reader would think she would fear incredibly, right? But that's Luke's way of showing us that her response is completely different. It says she considered in her mind what sort of greeting this would be. Here's the first defining characteristic of Mary in Luke's Gospel. She is the one who welcomes and ponders. She takes the new things in deeply. And in this case, most pointedly, the Word of God she takes in deeply. It continues, they both ask a question. His is about himself, hers is about the word she's heard. Help me to understand. Mary is the one who ponders, who is attentive, who is comfortable in silence. In fact, in many, you can even see it here on her lap, there's a book open. They didn't have books. It would have been a scroll. But the point being, she is one who was faithful to the scriptures, whose memory and mind was conformed to the scriptures. She was open and willing and ready to receive God's word. Where did I put my little thing? There it is. That's the first thing I'll say. The second then, you see this pondering, this considering, this taking in deeply continued in some of the other episodes in the infancy narratives. Even just in Luke's gospel, at the presentation of Jesus at the temple to the priest Simeon and to the priestess Anna, he says to her, in receiving this child, who he now knows to be the long-awaited Savior, your heart will be pierced for love of him, so that the thoughts of many will be known. Her heart is focused on, as it has been already a couple of times in Luke's gospel. At the beginning, in the Annunciation, at the announcement of the shepherds who tell of the angelic pronouncement, it says, all who heard this wondered and marveled, but she pondered these things in her heart. What we're getting about Mary is one who takes things in deeply and reflects on them. And then even lastly, the last mystery in the infancy narratives, the end of Luke 2, is the finding of Jesus in the temple after they've left him there for 3 days. He's a 12-year-old. You've had 12-year-olds. You're like, leave the 12-year-old for 3 days. Grow up and we'll come back and get you. So they come back. I have a 12-year-old. Like, we want to do this. They come back. He said, did you not know that your father and I were searching for you? How were you searching? Did you not know that I must be in my father's house doing my father's business? And it says they were astounded at what he said and did not understand. But then it says at the end of the infancy narrative, and Mary pondered all these things in her heart. And when it says that at the close of the infancy narrative, it means all the things that day in the temple, but it means all the things that she has encountered with this child of hers from the moment the angel spoke to her. She pondered them in her heart. What we get from Mary here as the first and perfect disciple is the one who is attentive and ready, who takes things in and pays attention deeply. And if we think about the kind of world we live in now, not just for our children, but for ourselves, this, among all things, I think, is the least well-rehearsed ability, the least well-rehearsed skill, to pay close attention to things. But notice, in the portrait of the first and perfect disciple, it is the very first thing noted. Nothing else goes, if not that. So what then do I think comes in this modern-day education, the kind of education that we would seek to offer here? I think it has to do with forming people in the cultivation of the power of attention. Attention to what? Really, to anything. To what you're studying in these classes. To other people that you're around. To the needs of the community. The cultivation of the power of attention itself is a goal. Does that make sense? Not just attention to certain types of content, but the cultivation of the power of attention itself. One of the essay writers that I like very much, the 20th century essay writer Simone Weil, has this beautiful 7-page essay called The Right Use of School Studies with a View to the Love of God. And she says, attention is, itself, the sole and most important object of studies. My students hate that. We read it on the first day of class always, and then we come back to it at the end. They're like, okay, I get it, right? Because it's like, oh, I need to get this out. No, she's saying, actually, the cultivation of attention is the most important thing out of studies. She also says, attention is the rarest and purest gift, rarest and purest form of generosity, to give yourself over to something, to the word of another, to something that you're studying, to reading. The other part of this, I think, is striving for mastery. I shared some of these things with students today. It was an overwhelming scene. Like, they were on both sides. There's 2,000 of them. I'm not like a jump up and down sort of speaker, but these are some of the things I tried to share with the students in different ways. Striving for mastery as part of that attentiveness. Mastery of the material you're studying. Mastery of the craft you're apprenticing in. Athletics, arts, any of the arts, right? Music, theater. The kinds of service and leadership, striving after that mastery, which takes long, concentrated attention, which is really hard and costly. These sort of things. Secondly, I don't want to get bogged down too long in any one place. Secondly, the glory. I'm actually going to do these in order. I think it begins with honor. I think that's the basis of a rich it begins with honor. It's the basis of a rich and vibrant educational community. The cultivation of attention. Oftentimes it will mean limitation also. Think about that, right? If there are too many things, you can't pay attention to them. Limitation is part of the art of attentiveness. It starts with that. It ends with glory. The way from one to the other, I think, is love. In the life of Mary, we see the glory. Here's part of the not so great religious art, but the Assumption and Coronation of Mary, the last of the glorious mysteries. What do Catholics profess here? The Assumption of Mary, that she who was wholly obedient to the Word of God, who gave her whole self to it, was fully integrated and made whole by that Word that she loved. That was the return gift of her Son to her, of God to her, was to hold her complete and intact, body and soul. And in the Assumption, she wholly and completely, body and soul, is elevated into communion with God. Right? This is the thing that's ahead of Christians in hope. What first has taken place as the fruit of Jesus' life and love in her is also the fruit that Christians hope for. To be made whole, and in fact, to reign. To be able to share in the reign of the Son, which is a reign of mercy and of love, whole and complete with all of ourselves. To be made whole, right? Think about how much, maybe for ourselves, for our children, for others, we don't feel whole, like we're pulled apart, like our bodies are one place, our soul, our minds are in another. Like our attention is scattered all over the place. Like there's all kinds of things that have a purchase on me. But to be able to be whole and complete and fully available and attentive, and to have your dignity fully recognized in that. That's what I think the glory here beckons from us. So what does that mean for the education? I think it has to do with a continual habitual practice towards the students, towards your children, of showing them their dignity, their whole dignity, in their body, in their souls, in their affections, in their emotions, in their intellectual life, in their spiritual life, to honor it all, but also, therefore, to challenge them to honor it all, and to honor that dignity of others. That can't just be a message that we teach from the front of a classroom. That's part of the culture, I think, to build a culture where that is the way in which we see ourselves, or we allow our students to see themselves and to see others. It's a hard thing because so many other things are giving them partial views of themselves and others. But to have a community that's focused on that, and that the whole of our lives is ordered to that end. Not just to satisfy the needs of the body, not to despair of our body and just desire the things of the mind or of the affections, but the whole of who we are is ordered to that glorious end. We're almost done with the homily portion of this. Then lastly, love. If we think about all of the mysteries in the life of Mary with Jesus, all of them are exercises in love. And what do I mean about that? I don't mean just something soft and cuddly and warm. I mean love as the active exercise of making sacrifices, of choosing the good of the other, of putting down one's own impulses for the sake of doing what is good. Where do we see this with Mary? We see it all throughout. In the Annunciation, let it be done to me according to your word. What happens with that? All the other possibilities have to be closed down in order to say yes to this. In The wedding at Cana, she is the first to recognize the need of the other and knows to bring it to her son and leave it there. Do whatever he tells you. Most especially, I think, at the foot of the cross. I don't think Christians reflect on Mary at the foot of the cross enough. Because here, certainly, this is Jesus' sacrifice, the gift of his whole life. Certainly, this is the Father's sacrifice, the gift of his Son for the life of the world, as we hear in John 3:16. But it's also her sacrifice. Here is my son, she could say. Here is the one I have cherished and pondered from the beginning. Here is the one I have loved with everything I could love. And she too is asked to let him go. How much? So much that he even says to her, "Woman, behold your son," and doesn't mean himself. He means the beloved disciple, John. Receive him and love him as if it were me. By the same token, receive your mother. In other words, Mary, receive his love as if it were my love for you. The sacrifice, the will to do that. But then also maybe in the end we see in the Pentecost account, certainly the 12 apostles are there, but it says there are 120, and Mary is named in their number. And she is one of the only other ones named by name. She's the center of that new community. What is being born there? The body of her son, the church, the whole community of disciples that she's called to love. And that stretches her even further. It's in some ways the fruit of those sacrifices, but in another way, as we all know, to continue loving means to love more, to make new sacrifice. What does this mean for our education? What are we hoping for our children, our students to be able to do? I think to become capable of mercy. The full virtue of mercy has two parts. One, Thomas Aquinas would say, is aesthetic perceptivity. In other words, to be able to recognize beauty as beauty and therefore to recognize its lack. In other words, to see suffering as suffering. Why do even children who see other children in depressed countries with distended stomachs, why do they know that's not right? Because they have a sense, even children, especially children, of what the beauty would be of a healthy, nourished body. And they recognize something's not right. They recognize suffering as suffering. Strange things happens to us. We actually lose that ability. We dull ourselves to that because recognizing suffering as suffering is costly. It takes our time and attention. So part of the Catholic education, I think, is to resensitize our students, our children, to suffering as suffering. To be able to see it and name it, be knowledgeable about it, care about it. Then the second part is, as Thomas Aquinas would say, volitional action. To will to do something about it. In other words, to be capable of responding to the suffering you see. And you know as well as I do, we can't always take away the suffering we see. But the one thing we can surely always do is make sure that the one who is suffering does not suffer alone. And that, I think, is part of the mission of education for our children, our students, to capacitate them to recognize suffering and to respond, whether it's to heal or at least to accompany, to be with the others. The other part of this, I think, is not just about the sufferings, it's also to empower them. This is what I'm going to mostly talk to the teachers about tomorrow. Mostly to empower them to take risks, to take responsibility themselves. This is a hard part of education, actually, because we want, and sometimes when we care so much, we want to do it all for them. But the end of the education is to make them capable of taking responsibility themselves. To make the mistakes, to take the risks, to become capable of sacrifice. All right, it's the end of our homily. We good on that? Good. So here's what I want to do for the next 2.5 hours of our time. I want to take this. So I wrote some of these things out addressed to young adults, to high school students, so those going to college. It's based on a lot of other work I've done, but I've also recognized this is in some ways, for me, the fruit of the education I've received, which began here as my first Catholic school, which continued in college and my studies, but also in a lot of the ministry work and other types of work that I've done. How do we form and better educate our young people to be capable of the mature Christian life that we would hope for them? In other words, how do we help them to seek fullness? So in this book, I have a few copies back there, and any of them you see, you're welcome to just take. Those are as many as I could bring because I flew here. In any event, in this book, I addressed it almost like a series of letters directly to young people, right? Not like, hey, young person, right? But like to speak honestly and directly. And a lot of it is, by the end, actually each of the chapters, there are 20 of them, I took on the task of not just saying what's important and why, but how to take practical steps towards that end. So the 20 chapters all begin with how to, right? To hold myself accountable to giving something practical to the students. So I'm going to try and reflect on this in terms of the honor, glory, love. I'll speak on a number of these, probably not all of them exhaustively. Here are the chapters, and this I only saw in reflection afterwards. I didn't set out to do this. But actually, most of the chapters fall into one of these three, mostly. How to listen. So the first one's how to be real, but then it's how to listen, how to study and work, and then there are 3 chapters on how to pray. These will have something to do with honor. Glory. How to love your neighbor, how to date, how to have sex, chapter 10. I'm not joking, and there are no pictures. How to be Eucharistic. And I will speak on that one a little bit so you're not as concerned about what that is. And then lastly, how to sustain friendships, how to be uncomfortable, how to be mentored and how to mentor, how to grieve and how to find joy. There are a few others, but these are the ones that I'll sort of focus on. So I'm going to go through these a little bit at a time, give you some ideas here just to sort of appeal to our imaginations of the kind of culture that we create, not only in the school, but I think this is reflected in the home, to try and surround, build the kind of culture community to surround our students so that they may be formed as best as possible for this kind of full and complete life. All right. Here we go. How to listen. Here's basically what I do in speaking about how to listen. These 3 things are more or less what I spoke to the students about today in a different way. How to listen. What I focus that on mostly is the importance of removing distractions. Basically, recognizing that especially in our modern worlds, technologically saturated and otherwise, we are constantly enthralled to something. Distraction is the name of the game. Right? There's always something pinging at us. We can always run from one thing to the next. Our schedules are overstuffed. We're always in that rhythm, right? So the first part of this is actually to build in the time and the space for something else. Actually intentionally breaking that monotony. In the spiritual life, the 3 stages of spiritual growth, this would be the stage of the purgative. In other words, you have to purge the old thing before you can start taking on the new thing. So what is the purging here? To break from the monotony. How do I recommend doing that? I think doing this as practically as possible, habitually, with small commitments. First of all, to do this daily. And this is what I suggested to the students today. I don't know if they'll do it. Some of them will. To do this daily. At least, let's say, 15 minutes a day, preferably the same time every day, that is not everything else. That is guarded for quiet, focused, reflective attention. Preferably in prayer, but even if not in prayer, and to be honest with the students, I was trying to be honest with them, I know many of them struggle with their faith, or they're not sure how to pray. Well, at least start with this. 15-minute blocks, same time every day, where you're not doing all the other things. Second part, to do this weekly. This is really hard. It's especially hard on our college campus. To observe, this is old-fashioned, a Sabbath. A day that's removed from the other days. That is not just more work, more activity, more mindless whatever, but actually a day removed from that. Now, on a college campus where our high holy day is usually a Saturday with its own liturgy and everything in a football stadium, that's a hard thing to do because Sunday then becomes the day of work. And guys, that Saturday wasn't the Sabbath, right? So in order to observe this, what do you have to do? You have to order your other 6 days. This day comes first, and the other 6 days have to hold the work. Make sense? Then the last thing, this might be the most challenging, has to do with the in-between times. What do I mean by that? You know all these in-between times where we're waiting in line somewhere, or somebody's late for an appointment, or this, that, or the other thing? We immediately, most of us, and especially our students, reach for the phone or something to just distract us, engage us. Now, each of those individual moments is not that big of a deal, but the cumulative effect of all of those is it forms us to constantly reach out for distraction, to constantly reach out for a little sweet. So to work against that tendency, to build up more of the muscle and the ability to be attentive to where we are. So those are the 3 ways in which I would speak about that: daily, weekly, and in the in-between times. Does this make sense? These are hard things, right? All of these things, you can't start them all at once. In some ways, you start with one of these, one area, and go through that, and then pick up another and pick up another. It'll sound like, my gosh, this is a lot to do. Well, this is how we build a whole culture, because we're already imbued in a different kind of culture that's forming us in different ways. Okay? Second then, how to study and work. I'll be brief on this. Here's the enemy here, multitasking. Multitasking is always the enemy. Some of the research on multitasking finds that those who multitask all the time cannot filter out irrelevancy. In other words, everything comes at the same volume. They can't filter out irrelevancy. Moreover, our brain, the more we multitask, our brain tells us that we are getting better at paying attention to all the things that we're paying attention to the more we multitask. When in fact, we are becoming worse at attending to all those things. It's a nefarious little trick our brains play on us. You become a less attentive person overall. I'll share this with the teachers tomorrow too. So multitasking is the enemy here. But I think that is one of the major things that we educate people in. It's one of the major things I've been educated in, and I value, is how to do lots of things all the time. If I'm doing just one thing, it feels like a loss. So to work against that. And part of that is in study and work. To prepare, set aside time and to prepare space for study and work. What is the setting aside time? To dedicate particular blocks of time, starting with 30 minutes up to hopefully 90 minutes. That's where the optimal type of work happens. It's hard for high school students to start there, for sure. Hard for me to start there. 30 minutes of uninterrupted attention on what you're doing. Studying this, paying attention to that, practicing this skill, whatever. Where it's not, I have my phone here and I'll just quickly check, or I have the computer there and I can quickly do that, or I'm surrounded by lots of other people with really quick outs. Because there's also a delay when you go to put your attention back. We call it an attention residue. The attention you've spent on other things stays with you, and it takes a longer time to get back to the thing that you were trying to pay attention to, right? So a lot of this is very practical. It's the way we're built. But this is also a practice that has to be built up. The other part of that, setting aside time, is preparing space to take away distraction. Particular types of space where work is done, where those distractions beforehand are taken away. Right? Okay. I can say more about that, but I think you get the point. And then lastly, prayer. These 3 things in particular hang together. The first thing, I won't say too much about this, is actually to practice begging. That's how prayer begins. Prayer is actually, first of all, begging God, which is humiliating, right? We're not like, hey, here's my equal, I'm going to share something with. It actually begins with begging. But putting that aside, very similar to these previous 2, dedicating time, same time, regular time, first thing on the schedule, preparing a space, and then the practices of reflecting on prayer afterwards, even if it's just writing out one line. Writing out a page in a journal, usually no more than that, to gather some of the fruits or even the challenges of that is a way of honoring the prayer that we've done. Okay? So I think these are some of the things that relate to honoring, as I said. Let me speak about a couple of more of these. Loving your neighbor. So I've got 2 chapters in this book, how to begin to love your neighbor and then how to actually love your neighbor. The first chapter was almost called how to not hate your neighbor, but I thought we'll put a little positive spin on it. Pietro Molla, who was the husband of St. Gianna Beretta Molla, in his reflections upon how they were raised or how they were formed in their really important late teen and early 20-something years when they were first married, he said, the thing that made the biggest difference for us, for me especially, Pietro, was we were involved in this association called Catholic Action. And what we did is we got together regularly with the people who lived around us, and we got to know their stories. And then we served the needs of people in our community with the other people that were in Catholic Action, and we got to know them for who they were. And Pietro Molla, who lived during the rise of fascism in Italy, said, that primarily is what saved me from fascism, from the allure of hating my neighbor, because I learned to respect the people around me because I knew them. That has struck me for years now as so simple and so utterly important. It saved his soul, most likely. It's what helped to form his wife as a saint. That kind of attention to others, right? That's how to begin to love your neighbor. How to actually do it is to make the regular habit of that. So the examining daily, I think, is, and this is something I suggested to the young folks today, is to examine at the end of each day, even if just for 5 or 10 minutes, what were my interactions like with others? Did I offend? Did I see something in someone that I should follow up on? Is somebody suffering and I maybe didn't see it? To make a regular habit of that. 5 to 10 minutes at the end of every day can be fairly quick. Secondly, to shift the sort of where you place yourself weekly. So at least once per week, go out of where you're comfortable being. And in a school environment, this comes pretty darn close to that cliched cafeteria example, right? Like, don't sit with your same group, go with the other group. Something like that, at least once weekly, to shift that. But then I would say monthly, to immerse yourself in a very different environment with people with very different stories from you. And that brings you to the soup kitchen. That brings you to a city council. Have you ever gone to a city council meeting? All kinds of different lives are going on there, right? To make a habit of that. Not necessarily the sexiest or most exciting things in the world, but to pay attention to those sorts of people. How to date. Here's what I offer. Here's what I suggest. First of all, setting this up, you can't just date when you want to date. Lots of people want to date and it doesn't just happen, right? So part of that is preparing yourself, even beforehand, for being the sort of person who is ready to date somebody else. And part of this is practicing truthfulness, while dating or even beforehand. Those little white lies that kind of enter into relationships with others, where you don't quite give what you're thinking about, you sort of shield it. I don't mean just like blatant honesty all the time, but those little white lies where you sort of shield it, this is where I think relationships start to break down from the inside. Because you start to open up little parallel lives to each other. So this practice of truthfulness, and sometimes if you're not truthful, practicing confessing to the other. You know, when I said this before, I actually didn't tell you the whole truth. Here's what was really going on. I was a little bit embarrassed about it, but right? Practicing truthfulness. Practicing follow through. So here's an example I give based on one that I shared earlier. You make plans with your honey boo for the weekend, right? You're dating. And at the beginning, you can't imagine doing anything else. Like, of course you want to be with this person. But you know, a few months in, it's not all that exciting anymore. And you made plans, but now your friends are doing this, right? And you decide, I'd rather do that. And so you tell the person you're dating, I can't do it because, and you don't tell them the real reason, right? Follow through here means stick to, on the one hand, the plans you have, or if you're shifting, be honest about why. Now, this isn't just about becoming like a better potential husband or wife. This is about becoming a person of character, one who tells the truth and bears the cost of it, right? That's what this is all about. And then lastly, being present. This becomes really difficult. At the beginning, you can't imagine anything else but just being completely overwhelmed by the other person. But you know, several months in, you get bored. Conversations are boring, right? Wading through that, coming back to being attentive, not giving your attention all kinds of other places through your phone or what else when you're with the person. These are hard practices, but they're also, I think, the essential practices of dating, the completely lost art. How to have sex, I need to tell you. But what I ultimately share here are two things. And you'll see in the end, hopefully, like where these are coming from. The first is to be there, to be wholly and fully there, present. That's a really hard thing, to be fully present to another person. The second part is to pledge yourself completely. And pledging yourself completely means not just for now, but into the future. So the way I try to present this to young people who might be reading this, 20-somethings or teenagers, is to give some of the understanding of this to kind of move along with them. What you see at the end is basically what I've described are the two components of Catholic marriage, right? Intimacy and union, but not starting there. That's not actually a good way, I think, to just start with the rules and then speak to people from there, but actually show the wisdom, the logic, and the aspiration of that. All right. And then lastly, how to become Eucharistic. Just like with studying or with prayer, it takes time for preparation, so too with receiving the Eucharist. The preparation, let's say for Saint Therese of Lisieux, she has, I don't know if you've ever read Therese of Lisieux. She just annoyed me forever because it's like everything's a little bit too cute by half. And this was one of those things too. She's like, when I am going to receive communion, I imagine my soul as a great field, and I clear out all the debris, and I erect a gigantic tent, and I welcome all the angels and the saints to come and open up a great orchestra. And I ask the Blessed Mother to endow me with her virtue so I may receive her beloved Son. And I'm like, girl, this is annoying, right? But like with most things that I've come to see in Therese, that sort of veneer of a little bit too cute hides incredible wisdom. And what she is showing here is that to receive the Lord, he never comes as an unwanted guest. There's no break-ins here. There's no home invasions. He only comes as a guest. And she is seeing that to receive him in the Eucharist means from her to prepare a place. And so preparing, helping our children, creating the kind of culture where we help people to prepare for Eucharist, it does mean to be attentive, to be ready, to bring our needs and our gifts, to be fully there, to confess as confession is needed, to pray to the saints and to the Blessed Mother, to prepare me better to love and receive your Son. But the other side of that, of a complete Eucharist, is the follow-through. And the follow-through is always the works of mercy. To become what we receive. We receive the love of God, now become an instrument of that love for others. Feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, counsel the doubtful, visit the imprisoned, visit the sick. All the works of mercy. Okay? All right, we're almost done here, guys. Last part on love. Sustaining friendships. You know this as well as I do because of our age, but we get out of the friend collecting business, that we're all in, like in high school and maybe into college years. And then it's like maybe the friend survival business, right? So how do you sustain relationships? Sustaining relationships, I believe, is all about prioritization, right? To make the commitment to continue this friendship and to be committed to each other. I recognize this in one of my closest friends, Pete. Some years ago, we were always doing things like similar things. We kind of worked together. We both were younger and we played basketball together regularly. But then I was having kids. He was getting a new job. We were both getting busy. And I don't remember which one of us, but one of us recognized, like, as these things were shifting, we are never going to hang out and see each other. So we made a commitment. This was like 8 or 10 years ago. You know what? We will put on the calendar for every Monday, we'll have lunch. Now, we happen to live in the same place. It goes on the calendar. Sometimes we have to cancel. I had to cancel this last Monday. He has to cancel next Monday. Fine. But it's easier, right, to cancel than it is to try to create. This happened again with one of my best friends from high school, Jason, who we're always wanting to talk, always wanting to catch up. He's had a lot of things go on in his life. I've had some things going on in mine. We're important to each other. And it's always like, we'll catch up, but we don't, right? I just had dinner at his house this week while I was visiting, and it's like, all right, here's what we're doing. We are going to put a time every month on the calendar to talk on the phone. If we have to change the date, we change the date, but we start with the commitment to be there, right? So that prioritization, this is kind of the nitty-gritty of love, I think, is that kind of follow through. To being uncomfortable. We can see the end, right? To being uncomfortable. Dorothy Day has this great essay where she says that we're all like octopuses. You take away one comfort and we reach for another. You take that one away, we reach for another. And part of what she's saying is we have to continually go through the practice of taming our impulses, because we always want to reach out for the things we like. She liked lots of things. She liked cigarettes, mostly. She liked certain kinds of food. She liked certain kinds of music. Those things were not necessarily bad in themselves. But she says if we're always reaching out for what we like, we just become subject to those impulses. So, getting used to being uncomfortable, I think, has two sides to it. One is the intentional practice of self-denial. Fasting, almsgiving, prayer, right? The things from Lent, but especially that fasting at periodic times throughout the year, different types of fasting, to give up things that we like that may not be bad for us, but to get used to doing that. Then the other side of this is practicing gratitude, because I think gratitude is another form of denial. It's, in the Gospels, there's these 10 lepers that go to get healed, and only one of them comes back to say thank you. That saying thank you cost him something. The others just go and enjoy this new freedom, the 9. He took some of that freedom and went back to offer praise and say thank you. I think gratitude is a form of cost, right, of sacrifice here. Last few. I'll say something more about be mentored, because this is where most of our young people are right now. They're not quite mentoring yet, but you never pass through a gate where it's like, now you're a mentor. It's just all of a sudden people start looking to you for things. But on being mentored, at least at Notre Dame, there are lots of people who are looking for lots of advice. They love discerning, right? They don't like actually making decisions. They like being mentored. They don't like following the advice they get. Maybe some of you have read, I'm sure many of you have read, The Brothers Karamazov. This is one of the ways I think about mentoring. Alyosha, who is from a very dysfunctional family, continually goes off to the monastery to be mentored by this old, very wise monk, Zosima. Alyosha reveres Zosima so much that he wants to follow Zosima's life. He wants to become a monk. And on his deathbed, Zosima says to Alyosha, this is not your path. I've come to know you. Your path is to lead the life of a monk out in the world, to transform your family. The easier thing for Alyosha to do is be like, nah, find a new mentor. Alyosha wrestled with that. And he followed that advice. Now let's say Alyosha, he really wrestled with it, and in the end he comes to a different decision. To be well mentored, to honor his mentor, would mean in that case to go back and make his case and actually explain why he's doing something else. The easier thing to do is just find another mentor who will tell me what I wanted to hear otherwise. You see that, let's say, in A Man for All Seasons, which some of you have probably read or seen. Story of St. Thomas More. At the beginning, this man, Richard Rich, who ends up being the one who leads to Thomas More's death. Richard Rich wants to be mentored by Thomas More, but he wants Thomas to help him secure a very prestigious post at court. And Thomas, who knows Richard and knows that Richard is not capable of the kind of bribes and things that would be offered to him, says, this is not the path for you. Be a teacher. You would make a great teacher. And he says, I don't want to be a teacher. I want to be a prominent person at court. And Thomas says, this is not your path. And Richard, instead of wrestling with that, he wants Thomas to give him permission. He goes and aligns himself with somebody else who will give him what he wants. And it leads to his downfall. Now, that's the most tragic version of that. But that, I think, becomes more common in how to be mentored. I want mentoring. I don't want that advice. I'll find something else. And that kind of mentoring, we get it all kinds of ways now. There's all these priests on the internet who are dispensing all kind of advice. They're not your pastor. They don't know you, right? There's all kinds of influencers that will show you the path that you want to follow, not who are reckoning with you as you are. I think this is a practice to be recovered, is forming students in how to be mentored and actually stick through to it. This is a really hard one, how to grieve. But here's the basics of it. And I've got a number of things I say on this, but the basics of it is this. To allow the things that hurt to hurt. And to be okay with them hurting and share that hurt with others. And in fact, be attentive to other people in their hurts and share that with them. There's more I could say about grieving, but that's the basics of it. All right. And then lastly, how to find joy. And I think this encapsulates everything else. I learned this from a number of different people, not least of which is most likely Mother Teresa, or this young mother theologian I knew, Beth Hale, who died in her 30s, mother of 4. Both of them are witnesses to leaving happiness to find joy. I'll just share a little bit about Mother Teresa here, for example. She didn't speak very often about her home life later in life, but when she did, she said it was a very happy home. It was a very happy home. And she chose to leave that home, not ever believing she'd be able to go back. In fact, her home was under the Iron Curtain after she left, to go pursue the calling that she believed she had to find joy. She went to India and she became a Sister of Loreto. And she said later on, I had never been happier than when I was a Sister of Loreto. She was teaching. She eventually became a mother within that community. But that's when she received her call to go and serve the poorest of the poor. She says the hardest thing she ever had to do was leave the convent of Loreto, where she was absolutely happy. But she also knew that to not follow this call would be to break faith. And so she left. She left happiness to go find joy. That is, I think, the hardest thing of all here, but it's what everything else leads up to leave the comfort, to leave the contentment, to leave the happiness, to leave the good things, to go seek something deeper and better, to die a little bit more to ourselves in order to find joy, right? All right. You've been very patient. These are some of the ways in which I think my education here and the education that began here and went afterwards, the way in which my experiences have been shaped, has helped me to think through and try to offer something for how to create the educational cultures, the home cultures, to guide our young people towards more of the fullness of life. I hope in some ways this is helpful for you, for us to think about how we take on this responsibility, this privileged responsibility, even more as a community for our own children, but also for other people's children here too. So I'll leave it with that, with my gratitude for your time and attention. And how about we close it up? Sound good? Back to Helen?
Yeah.
All right.
Kendra's going to close.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much. My pleasure.